The Kingdom of Scotland was a state in northwest Europe traditionally said to have been founded in 843, which joined with the Kingdom of England to form a unified Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707. Its territories expanded and shrank, but it came to occupy the northern third of the island of Great Britain, sharing a land border to the south with the Kingdom of England. It suffered many invasions by the English, but under Robert I it fought a successful war of independence and remained a distinct state in the late Middle Ages. In 1603, James VI of Scotland became King of England, joining Scotland with England in a personal union. In 1707, the two kingdoms were united to form the Kingdom of Great Britain under the terms of the Acts of Union. From the final capture of the royal borough of Berwick by the Kingdom of England in 1482, the territory of the Kingdom of Scotland corresponded to that of modern-day Scotland, bounded by the North Sea to the east, the Atlantic Ocean to the north and west, and the North Channel and Irish Sea to the southwest. The Crown was the most important element of government. The Scottish monarchy in the Middle Ages was a largely itinerant institution, before Edinburgh developed as a capital in the second half of the 15th century. The court remained at the centre of political life and in the 16th century emerged as a major centre of display and artistic patronage, until it was effectively dissolved with the Union of Crowns in 1603. The Scottish Crown adopted the conventional officers of Western European courts, and developed a Privy Council and great officers of state. Parliament also emerged as a major legal institution, gaining an oversight of taxation and policy, but never achieved the centrality to the national life of its counterpart in England. In the early period, the kings of the Scots depended on the great lords of the Mormaers and Toiseks, but from the reign of David I, sheriffdoms were introduced, which allowed more direct control and gradually limited the power of the major lordships. In the 17th century, the creation of justices of peace and commissioners of supply helped to increase the effectiveness of local government. The continued existence of courts baron and introduction of kirk sessions helped consolidate the power of local lairds. Scots law developed into a distinctive system in the Middle Ages and was reformed and codified in the 16th and 17th centuries. Under James IV, the legal functions of the council were rationalised, with a Royal Court of Session meeting daily in Edinburgh. In 1532, the Royal College of Justice was founded, leading to the training and professionalisation of lawyers. David I is the first Scottish king known to have produced his own coinage. Early Scottish coins were virtually identical in silver content to English ones, but from about 1300 the silver content began to depreciate more rapidly than English. At the Union of the Crowns in 1603, the Scottish pound was fixed at only 1/12 that of the English pound. The Bank of Scotland issued pound notes from 1704. Scottish currency was abolished at the Act of Union. Scotland is half the size of England and Wales in area, but has roughly the same amount of coastline, with the geography of Scotland divided between the Highlands and Islands and the Lowlands. The Highlands had a relatively short, growing season which was further shortened by the impact of the Little Ice Age. From its foundation to the Black Death, the population had grown from perhaps 500,000 to 1 million, then fell to 500,000. It probably expanded in the first half of the 16th century, reaching approximately 1.2 million by the 1690s. Significant languages in the medieval kingdom included Gaelic, Old English, Norse and French, but by the early modern era Middle Scots had begun to dominate. Christianity was introduced into Scotland from the 6th century. In the Norman period, the Scottish Church underwent a series of changes that led to new monastic orders and organisation. During the 16th century, Scotland underwent a Protestant Reformation that created a predominantly Calvinist national kirk. There were a series of religious controversies that resulted in divisions and persecutions. The Scottish Crown developed naval forces at various points in its history, but often relied on privateers and fought a guerre de course. land forces centered around the large common army, but adopted European innovations from the 16th century, and many Scots took service as mercenaries and as soldiers for the English crown. Scottish flags included the lion rampant and the saltire, the latter being incorporated into the Union flag from 1603. History. Origins. 400 to 943. From the 5th century AD, North Britain was divided into a series of petty kingdoms. Of these, the four most important were those of the Picts in the northeast, the Scots of Dalriata in the west, the Britons of Strathclyde in the southwest, and the Anglian kingdom of Bernicia in the southeast and stretching into modern northern England. This situation was transformed in AD 793 when ferocious Viking raids began on monasteries such as Iona and Lindisfarne, creating fear and confusion across the kingdoms of North Britain. Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles eventually fell to the Norsemen. These threats may have speeded a long-term process of Gaelicization of the Pictish kingdoms, which adopted Gaelic language and customs. There was also a merger of the Gaelic and Pictish crowns, although historians debate whether it was a Pictish takeover of Dalriata, or the other way around. This culminated in the rise of Synod mac Ailpinas, king of the Picts, in the 840s, which brought to power the House of Alpin. When he died as king of the combined kingdom in 900, one of his successors, Domnall II, was the first man to be called Rialban. The term Scotia would increasingly be used to describe the heartland of these kings, north of the River Forth, and eventually, the entire area controlled by its kings would be referred to as Scotland. The long reign of Donald's successor Constantine is often regarded as the key to formation of the Kingdom of Alba, Scotland, and he was later credited with bringing Scottish Christianity into conformity with the Catholic Church. Expansion. 943-1513 Male Coluim I annexed Strathclyde, over which the kings of Alba had probably exercised some authority since the later 9th century. The reign of David I has been characterized as a Davidian revolution, in which he introduced a system of feudal land tenure, established the first royal burghs in Scotland and the first recorded Scottish coinage, and continued a process of religious and legal reforms. Until the 13th century, the border with England was very fluid, with Northumbria being annexed to Scotland by David I, but lost under his grandson and successor Malcolm IV in 1157. The Treaty of York fixed the boundaries with England close to the modern border. By the reign of Alexander III, the Scots annexed the remainder of the western seaboard following the stalemate of the Battle of Largs with the Treaty of Perth in 1266. The Isle of Man fell under English control in the 14th century, despite several attempts to restore Scottish authority. The English were able to occupy most of Scotland under Edward I and annex a large slice of the lowlands under Edward III. But Scotland established its independence under figures including William Wallace in the late 13th century and Robert I and his successors in the 14th century in the Wars of Independence. This was helped by cooperation with the kings of France, under the terms of what became known as the Old Alliance, which provided for mutual aid against the English. In the 15th century and early 16th century under the Stuart dynasty, despite a turbulent political history, the Crown gained greater political control at the expense of independent lords and regained most of its lost territory to approximately the modern borders of the country. The dowry of the Orkney and Shetland Islands in 1468 was the last great land acquisition for the kingdom. However, in 1482 Berwick, a border fortress and the largest port in medieval Scotland, fell to the English once again, for what was to be the final change of hands. The Old Alliance with France led to the heavy defeat of a Scottish army at the Battle of Flodden Field in 1513 and the death of the King James IV, which would be followed by a long period of political instability, consolidation and union. 1513 to 1707 In the 16th century, under James V of Scotland and Mary, Queen of Scots, The Crown and Court took on many of the attributes of the Renaissance and new monarchy, despite long minorities, civil wars and intervention by the English and French. The mid-16th century Scottish Reformation was strongly influenced by Calvinism, leading to widespread iconoclasm and the introduction of a Presbyterian system of organisation and discipline that would have a major impact on Scottish life. In the late 16th century, James VI emerged as a major intellectual figure with considerable authority over the kingdom. In 1603 he inherited the thrones of England and Ireland, creating a union of the crowns that left the three states with their separate identities and institutions. He also moved the centre of royal patronage and power to London. When James' son Charles I of England attempted to impose elements of the English religious settlement on Scotland, the result was the Bishops' Wars, which ended in defeat for the king in a virtually independent Presbyterian Covenant estate in Scotland. It also helped precipitate the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, during which the Scots carried out major military interventions. After Charles I's defeat, the Scots backed the king in the Second English Civil War. After his execution, they proclaimed his son Charles II of England king, resulting in the Third English Civil War against the emerging republican regime of Roundheads in England led by Oliver Cromwell. The results were a series of defeats and the short-lived incorporation of Scotland into the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland. After the 1660 restoration of the monarchy, Scotland regained its separate status and institutions, while the centre of political power remained in London. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688–89, in which James VII was deposed by his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange in England, Scotland accepted them under the Claim of Right Act 1689. But the deposed main hereditary line of the Stuarts became a focus for political discontent known as Jacobitism, leading to a series of invasions and rebellions mainly focused on the Scottish Highlands. After severe economic dislocation in the 1690s, there were moves that led to political union with England as the Kingdom of Great Britain, which came into force on 1 May 1707. The English and Scottish parliaments were replaced by a combined Parliament of Great Britain, but it sat in Westminster and largely continued English traditions without interruption. 45 Scots were added to the 513 members of the House of Commons and 16 Scots to the 190 members of the House of Lords. It was also a full economic union, replacing the Scottish systems of currency, taxation and laws regulating trade. Government. The unified Kingdom of Alba retained some of the ritual aspects of Pictish and Scottish kingship. These can be seen in the elaborate ritual coronation at the Stone of Scone at Scone Abbey. While the Scottish monarchy in the Middle Ages was a largely itinerant institution, Scone remained one of its most important locations, with royal castles at Stirling and Perth becoming significant in the later Middle Ages before Edinburgh developed as a capital in the second half of the 15th century. The crown remained the most important element of government, despite the many royal minorities. In the late Middle Ages, it saw many of the aspects of aggrandizement associated with the new monarchs elsewhere in Europe. Theories of constitutional monarchy and resistance were articulated by Scots, particularly George Buchanan, in the 16th century. But James VI of Scotland advanced the theory of the divine right of kings, and these debates were restated in subsequent reigns and crises. The court remained at the centre of political life and in the 16th century emerged as a major centre of display and artistic patronage, until it was effectively dissolved with the union of the crowns in 1603. The Scottish Crown adopted the conventional offices of Western European courts, including High Steward, Chamberlain, Lord High Constable, Earl Mareschal and Lord Chancellor. The King's Council emerged as a full-time body in the 15th century, increasingly dominated by laymen and critical to the administration of justice. The Privy Council, which developed in the mid-16th century, and the great offices of state, including the Chancellor, Secretary and Treasurer, remained central to the administration of the government, even after the departure of the Stuart monarchs to rule in England from 1603. However, it was often sidelined and was abolished after the Acts of Union 1707, with rule direct from London. The Parliament of Scotland also emerged as a major legal institution, gaining an oversight of taxation and policy. By the end of the Middle Ages it was sitting almost every year, partly because of the frequent minorities and regencies of the period, which may have prevented it from being sidelined by the monarchy. In the early modern era was also vital to the running of the country, providing laws and taxation. But it had fluctuating fortunes and never achieved the centrality to the national life of its counterpart in England before it was disbanded in 1707. In the early period the kings of the Scots depended on the great lords of the Mormaers and Toiseks, but from the reign of David I, sheriffdoms were introduced, which allowed more direct control and gradually limited the power of the major lordships. The continued existence of courts baron and introduction of kirk sessions helped consolidate the power of local lairds. Law. Scots law developed into a distinctive system in the Middle Ages and was reformed and codified in the 16th and 17th centuries. Knowledge of the nature of Scots law before the 11th century is largely speculative, but it was probably a mixture of legal traditions representing the different cultures inhabiting the land at the time, including Celtic, Brittonic, Irish and Anglo-Saxon customs. The legal tract, the Leges Interpretos et Scotos, set out a system of compensation for injury and death based on ranks and the solidarity of congroups. There were popular courts or comtales, indicated by dozens of place names in eastern Scotland. In Scandinavian-held areas, Feudal law formed the basis of the legal system, and it is known that the Hebrides were taxed using the ounceland measure. Althings were open-air governmental assemblies that met in the presence of the Jarl, and the meetings were open to virtually all free men. At these sessions decisions were made, laws passed and complaints adjudicate. The introduction of feudalism in the reign of David I of Scotland would have a profound impact on the development of Scottish law, establishing feudal land tenure over many parts of the south and east that eventually spread northward. Sheriffs, originally appointed by the king as royal administrators and tax collectors, developed legal functions. Feudal lords also held courts to adjudicate disputes between their tenants. By the 14th century some of these feudal courts had developed into petty kingdoms, where the king's courts did not have authority except for cases of treason. Burghs also had their local laws dealing mostly with commercial and trade matters and may have become similar in function to sheriff's courts. Ecclesiastical courts had exclusive jurisdiction over matters such as marriage, contracts made on oath, inheritance and legitimacy. Judices were often royal officials who supervised baronial, abbatial and other lower-ranking courts. However, the main official of law in the post-Davidian kingdom of the Scots was the justiciar, who held courts and reported to the king personally. Normally, there were two justiciarships, organized by linguistic boundaries. The Justiciar of Scotia and the Justiciar of Lothian, but sometimes Galloway also had its own justiciar. Scottish common law, the jus commune, began to take shape at the end of the period, assimilating Gaelic and Celtic law with practices from Anglo-Norman England and the continent. During the period of English control over Scotland there is some evidence that King Edward I of England, called Hammer of the Scots, attempted to abolish Scottish laws contrary to English law as he had done in Wales. Under Robert I in 1318, the Parliament at Scone enacted a code of law that drew upon older practices. It codified procedures for criminal trials and protections for vassals from ejection from the land. From the 14th century there are surviving examples of early Scottish legal literature, such as the Regum Majestatem and the Quonum Attachmenta, which drew on both common and Roman law. Customary laws, such as the law of Clan Macduff, came under attack from the Stuart dynasty, which consequently extended the reach of Scots common law. From the reign of King James I, a legal profession began to develop and the administration of criminal and civil justice was centralised. The growing activity of the Parliament and the centralisation of administration in Scotland called for the better dissemination of acts of the Parliament to the courts and other enforcers of the law. In the late 15th century, unsuccessful attempts were made to form commissions of experts to codify, update or define Scots law. The general practice during this period, as evidenced from records of cases, seems to have been to defer to specific Scottish laws on a matter when available and to fill in any gaps with provisions from the common law embodied in civil and canon law, which had the advantage of being written. Under James IV, the legal functions of the council were rationalised, with the Royal Court of Session meeting daily in Edinburgh to deal with civil cases. In 1514 the office of Justice General was created for the Earl of Argyll. In 1532 the Royal College of Justice was founded, leading to the training and professionalisation of an emerging group of career lawyers. The Court of Session placed increasing emphasis on its independence from influence, including from the King, and superior jurisdiction over local justice. Its judges were increasingly able to control entry to their own ranks. In 1672 the High Court of Justiciary was founded from the College of Justice as a Supreme Court of Appeal.